President Donald Trump has just done something that no American president has done in modern history. Not during the Cold War, not during the War on Terror, not during any previous trade dispute with Europe. He has threatened 8 NATO allies with punishing tariffs, not over trade disputes, not over defense spending, but because they refuse to hand over a sovereign territory. On January 17, 2026, Trump posted on Truth Social demanding the complete and total purchase of Greenland, threatening 10% tariffs starting February 1st, escalating to 25% by June 1st, on Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. His justification: unless these countries facilitate the sale of Greenland to the United States, they will pay an economic price. This is not diplomatic posturing. This is an American president publicly using economic warfare against America's closest allies to force them to cede territory that belongs to Denmark. The timing made this explosive. The World Economic Forum in Davos was already underway when Trump's ultimatum landed. Within hours, the issue dominated every conversation at the forum, pushing aside planned discussions on Ukraine, global economic recovery, and climate change. European leaders who had arrived expecting to talk about traditional agenda items found themselves confronting something they never anticipated: an allied nation behaving like an adversary. The market reaction was immediate and brutal. On January 20th, the S&P 500 plunged 2.06%, erasing all of its 2026 gains and wiping out over $1.2 trillion in market value. The Nasdaq dropped 2.39%. The Dow shed 870 points. European markets followed. Germany's DAX fell 1%. The UK's FTSE 100 dropped 0.7%. France's CAC 40 slid 0.7%. This wasn't speculation about future risk. This was investors watching a trade war ignite in real time and running for the exits. And here's the part that signals how serious this has become. Gold surged above $4,800 per ounce, a record high. When investors pile into gold at that level, it means they've stopped believing that traditional markets can provide safety. The VIX Volatility Index, sometimes called Wall Street's fear gauge, spiked to 20.99, its highest level in 8 weeks. The so-called Sell America trade emerged, where investors dump U.S. stocks and bonds simultaneously because they no longer trust American stability. That matters. When America's own financial markets treat American policy as a source of global risk, something fundamental has shifted. The thing about financial markets is they're not sentimental. They don't care about rhetoric or political posturing. They care about probability. And what the markets are pricing in right now is the real possibility of a sustained trade conflict between the United States and its most important economic partners. Not a theoretical risk, a present danger. This is also worth noting. The market reaction wasn't a one-day event. The sell-off continued into January 21st, with Asian markets extending losses and European futures pointing lower. Investors are not treating this as a temporary shock that will quickly reverse. They're repositioning portfolios for what could become a prolonged period of instability. Now let's establish exactly what Trump is demanding and why this has triggered such a severe response. Greenland is an autonomous territory of Denmark. It has been part of the Danish realm since 1953 and gained self-governance in 2009. About 56,000 people live there, mostly Inuit, and they have their own parliament and prime minister. Denmark handles Greenland's foreign policy and defense, but the territory controls its internal affairs. Trump's interest in Greenland is not new. He first floated the idea of purchasing it during his first term in 2019, which Denmark dismissed as absurd, but this time he's backed the demand with specific economic threats and has refused to rule out military force. When asked how far he would go, Trump replied, "You'll find out." His stated rationale centers on national security. He argues that Greenland's Arctic location makes it essential for America's Golden Dome anti-missile system. He claims the territory is needed to counter Russian and Chinese influence in the Arctic. He has described this as vital to the safety, security, and survival of our planet. Here's what that argument leaves out. The United States already has a massive military presence in Greenland. Pituffik Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base, has operated since 1951 under a bilateral defense agreement between the U.S. and Denmark. American forces already conduct missile defense operations there. The U.S. already has the strategic access Trump claims to need, so the question becomes, why demand ownership of territory you can already use? The answer appears to lie in what Greenland sits on. The territory contains some of the world's largest deposits of rare earth minerals, materials essential for advanced electronics, electric vehicles, and military equipment. China currently dominates global rare earth production. Controlling Greenland would give the United States an alternative supply that bypasses Chinese influence entirely. But there's more to consider here. The Arctic is warming faster than almost any other region on Earth. As ice melts, new shipping routes are opening. The northern sea route along Russia's coast is already becoming viable for commercial traffic during summer months. A northwest passage through Canadian and Greenlandic waters could eventually provide an alternative to the Panama Canal for shipping between Asia and the Atlantic. Whoever controls access to these routes gains significant leverage over global trade. Greenland also sits atop enormous untapped reserves of oil and natural gas. Estimates vary, but some studies suggest the waters around Greenland could contain billions of barrels of petroleum. As the Arctic becomes more accessible, that energy potential becomes increasingly valuable. None of this is secret. Analysts have understood Greenland's strategic importance for decades. What's changed is the method being used to pursue that importance. Previous American administrations sought to strengthen the U.S.-Danish relationship, invest in Greenlandic development, and maintain the existing defense arrangements. Trump has chosen a different path, coercion rather than cooperation. This is where the economic calculus collides with international law. Under international norms, the same norms the United States helped establish after World War II, nations do not acquire territory through economic coercion or military threat. What Trump is proposing directly contradicts the principles America championed for 7 decades, and European leaders have noticed. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen delivered a pointed rebuke at Davos on January 20th. She called Trump's tariff threats a mistake, especially between long-standing allies. She referenced the July 2025 US-EU trade agreement that had capped tariffs at 15% on most goods, a deal that took months to negotiate. Her message was blunt. In politics, as in business, a deal is a deal, and when friends shake hands, it must mean something. That line matters. Von der Leyen was publicly accusing the U.S. president of breaking his word. She wasn't using diplomatic hedging or careful ambiguity. She was stating, in front of the world's business and political elite, that America can no longer be trusted to honor its commitments. She went further. She warned that Trump's approach risks a downward spiral that would only aid the very adversaries we are both so committed to keeping out of the strategic landscape. She was referring to Russia and China, the same countries Trump claims he's trying to counter. Her argument: this coercion strengthens exactly the rivals Trump says he wants to weaken. Von der Leyen pledged that the EU's response would be unflinching, united, and proportional. She affirmed full solidarity with Denmark and Greenland, declaring their territorial sovereignty non-negotiable, and she announced plans for a massive EU investment surge in Greenland's economy and infrastructure, essentially telling Washington that Europe will compete for influence in the Arctic rather than hand it over. There's a strategic calculation embedded in that response. Von der Leyen understands that simply condemning Trump won't change his behavior. But offering Greenland an alternative, European investment, European partnership, European support for its economy, gives the territory's leaders a reason to resist American pressure. It changes the incentive structure. Instead of facing Washington's demands alone, Greenland now has a counterweight. She also announced plans for enhanced EU defense spending on Arctic capabilities, including icebreakers and surveillance systems. This signals Europe's intention to become a more independent Arctic power, not dependent on American assets that come with American conditions attached. The reactions from individual European leaders amplified this stance. French President Emmanuel Macron, speaking at Davos, called Trump's approach new colonialism and new imperialism. He described it as useless aggressivity that seeks to weaken and subordinate Europe. He raised the possibility of activating the EU's anti-coercion instrument, a trade tool specifically designed to counter economic bullying for the first time against the United States. That language from Macron, new colonialism, is deliberately provocative. France knows something about colonialism. It spent centuries building and then losing a global empire. For a French president to apply that term to American conduct carries historical weight that European audiences immediately understand. Macron isn't just criticizing policy. He's placing Trump's behavior in a category of actions that civilized nations are supposed to have abandoned. Macron also made another point that received less attention, but carries significant implications. He suggested that Trump's Greenland fixation is distracting from more urgent matters, specifically efforts to resolve the Ukraine conflict. With Russia still occupying Ukrainian territory and diplomatic efforts stalled, European leaders have limited bandwidth for manufactured crises. Trump's demands, in Macron's framing, are not just wrong in themselves, they're consuming attention that should go to genuine security threats. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer called the tariffs completely wrong, though he advocated for resolution through calm discussion. That's a measured response from a leader trying to preserve the US-UK relationship, but even Starmer drew a clear line. This crosses the boundary of acceptable behavior among allies. The UK is in a particularly awkward position here. Since Brexit, Britain has sought to strengthen its bilateral relationship with the United States, positioning the special relationship as a counterweight to reduced European ties. Now that relationship is being tested. Starmer cannot afford to appear weak in the face of American pressure, but he also cannot afford to rupture ties with Washington entirely. His balancing act, condemning the tariffs while calling for dialogue, reflects that uncomfortable reality. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen was the most direct. "We are now being threatened by our closest ally," she said. "Europe will not be blackmailed." She emphasized that only Denmark and Greenland can decide the island's future, not Washington, not the EU, and certainly not through economic pressure. Frederiksen's response deserves particular attention because Denmark is the primary target. Her country is being asked to surrender territory it has held for centuries. The Danish public and Greenlandic public are watching closely. Any sign of wavering would trigger domestic political backlash. Frederiksen has essentially no room to negotiate on the fundamental question of sovereignty, regardless of what economic pressure Washington applies. And Greenland's own Prime Minister, Jens Frederik Nielsen, warned that his government is preparing for the possibility that threats could escalate further. He urged Western countries to remain united by respect for territorial integrity, a pointed reminder that Trump is violating the very norms NATO was built to defend. Nielsen has also suggested that Greenland is strengthening its own defenses, a remarkable statement when the potential threat comes from a supposed ally rather than an adversary. Here's where this becomes a systemic problem, rather than just a bilateral dispute. On January 18th, The leaders of all 8 targeted countries issued a joint statement. They expressed full solidarity with Denmark and Greenland. They affirmed their commitment to NATO's Arctic security mission, and they explicitly warned that Trump's tariff threats undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. 8 NATO members, including major military powers like France, Germany, and the UK, publicly stating that the American president is endangering the alliance. This isn't a minor diplomatic spat. This is a formal declaration that America's behavior has become destabilizing. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas put it in stark terms. China and Russia must be having a field day. Her point: America is dividing its own alliance, handing propaganda victories to adversaries, and undermining the credibility of Western unity, all to acquire an island that's already cooperating on defense. The EU has not simply condemned Trump's threats, it has begun preparing concrete countermeasures. The European Parliament froze ratification of a key US-EU trade deal that had been negotiated in July 2025. That agreement was meant to reduce tariffs and boost transatlantic commerce. By suspending it, Europe is sending a signal. If you use trade as a weapon, we will respond in kind. The EU is also considering deployment of its anti-coercion instrument, what some have called Europe's trade bazooka. This tool allows the EU to impose restrictions on U.S. market access, add charges to American imports, limit investments by U.S. companies, and exclude American firms from public contracts across the 27-nation bloc. It has never been used before. The fact that European officials are openly discussing using it against the United States, not China, not Russia, but America, reveals how severely this crisis has damaged trust. Let me explain what the anti-coercion instrument actually does, because it's significant. The EU created this tool in 2023 specifically to respond to economic pressure from other countries. It gives Brussels the authority to hit back against any nation using trade as a weapon, without requiring unanimous agreement from all member states. The measures available include tariffs, import quotas, restrictions on services, limits on foreign investment, and exclusion from government procurement. That last one matters enormously for American companies. The EU's combined public procurement market is worth hundreds of billions of euros annually. American firms compete for government contracts in everything from defense equipment to IT services to infrastructure construction. Being shut out of that market, even partially, would cost real money. The services dimension is equally important. The United States runs a significant trade surplus with the EU in services. American banks, consultancies, tech platforms, and professional services firms all generate substantial revenue from European clients. The anti-coercion instrument could restrict that access, creating costs for sectors that have largely escaped previous trade conflicts. French and German officials have floated additional options, including targeted duties on American goods and restrictions on U.S. tech platforms operating in Europe. The EU holds significant leverage here. American companies like Meta and Google depend heavily on access to the European market. Cutting that access even partially would carry real costs. Consider what happens if the EU decides to enforce its digital regulations more aggressively. European regulators already have significant authority over data privacy, content moderation, and competition in digital markets. American tech giants have spent years negotiating compliance frameworks. Those negotiations could become considerably less friendly if the political relationship deteriorates. Analysts at the European Council on Foreign Relations have advised a measured approach: prioritize unity, avoid self-damaging retaliation, and leverage Europe's market power strategically. They note that U.S. consumers would bear approximately 96% of the costs from Trump's tariffs, meaning the economic pain lands primarily on Americans, not Europeans. The recommendation is to buy time, wait for potential legal challenges in U.S. courts, and see whether American public opposition restrains the administration. That analysis points to something important about how tariffs actually work. When America puts tariffs on European goods, American importers pay those tariffs. They typically pass the costs to American consumers through higher prices. The European exporter might sell fewer products, but they don't directly pay the tariff. This means that Trump's tariffs are, in economic terms, a tax on American buyers of European goods. That last point deserves emphasis. Polling shows that 92% of Americans oppose using military force to take Greenland. While tariffs are less extreme than invasion, there's evidence that the broader American public does not support this confrontation. Whether that matters to the current administration is a different question. Now, let's talk about what happened at Davos itself, because the forum became ground zero for this transatlantic rupture. The World Economic Forum has always been a gathering where global elites discuss the future of the international order. CEOs, heads of state, central bankers, and thought leaders come to network, negotiate, and shape the narrative around major issues. The tone is typically optimistic, or at least constructive. Problems are framed as challenges to be solved through cooperation. This year was different. When Trump arrived at the World Economic Forum, the atmosphere had already shifted. One analyst predicted a big bang upon his arrival. Instead of the usual Davos conversations about innovation, investment, and global cooperation, attendees found themselves navigating an alliance in crisis. The hallway conversations, which at Davos are often more important than the official panels, centered on a single question: what is America doing? European executives who had come expecting to discuss supply chains and digital transformation found themselves fielding questions about whether their businesses would survive a trade war. Government officials who had planned to talk about climate policy instead huddled in emergency sessions about tariff countermeasures. The scheduled programming became almost irrelevant. Sessions on Ukraine, which had been expected to dominate the agenda, were overshadowed by the immediate crisis. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Trump's justification for pressuring Europe over Greenland includes concerns about Russian influence, yet his actions were diverting attention from an actual Russian invasion. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent attempted damage control, urging other nations to follow America First principles while dismissing European concerns as hysteria. He called for calm and affirmed U.S. reliability, but his reassurances landed flat with leaders who had just been threatened with tariffs for defending an ally's sovereignty. Bessent's performance illustrated a fundamental disconnect. He was essentially asking Europeans to trust American leadership, while the American president was demonstrating that America could not be trusted to honor its commitments. The message and the medium contradicted each other. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer described the tariff threats as setting the scene for negotiation, framing coercion as strategy. He urged Europeans to compartmentalize Greenland from broader trade discussions. That suggestion was effectively rejected. European leaders made clear that you cannot threaten allies with economic punishment and then expect them to treat it as a separate issue. The compartmentalization argument deserves scrutiny because it reveals a particular way of thinking about international relations. Greer was suggesting that Greenland could be isolated as a specific negotiation, while the broader US-EU relationship continued normally. But that's not how trust works. When you threaten someone's core interests, and sovereignty is a core interest, every other aspect of the relationship becomes suspect. European leaders understand that if the U.S. is willing to use economic coercion over territory today, it might use the same tactics over other issues tomorrow. The forum also revealed divisions in how different actors are processing this crisis. Some business leaders expressed hope that Trump's threats are bluffs, negotiation tactics that will ultimately lead to a deal without actual tariffs. This view holds that Trump, as a self-described deal-maker, is creating leverage rather than genuine conflict. But other observers note that Trump has already imposed significant tariffs in the past and has shown willingness to absorb economic costs for political objectives. His statement that there's no going back on Greenland suggests this isn't merely posturing. When asked directly if he would carry through, Trump said he would 100% implement the tariffs. Meanwhile, the public response in Denmark and Greenland has been fierce. Mass protests erupted in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, and across Denmark, with thousands marching under signs reading, "Greenland is not for sale." Demonstrators view Trump's demands as a form of neo-colonialism, a wealthy power attempting to take territory from a smaller nation through pressure rather than consent. The historical resonance is uncomfortable. This is how empires behaved in the 19th century, not how democracies are supposed to operate in the 21st. The Greenlandic protests carry particular weight because Greenlanders are the ones whose future is being discussed without their consent. The Inuit population has a complicated relationship with colonial history. Denmark's treatment of Greenland was not always benevolent, but that history makes Greenlanders especially sensitive to any suggestion that their territory can be traded like a commodity between great powers. The protests aren't just anti-Trump, they're assertions of Greenlandic identity and self-determination. In Copenhagen, demonstrations drew thousands more. Danish citizens wrapped themselves in flags and chanted slogans rejecting American interference. The protests crossed political lines. Conservatives and progressives, young and old, united in opposition to what they see as a fundamental threat to national sovereignty. Denmark's government, whatever its private calculations, cannot ignore this groundswell of public sentiment. Social media amplified the message globally. Images of Greenlandic children holding protest signs circulated widely. The contrast between Trump's aggressive rhetoric and peaceful Arctic communities facing uncertainty created a powerful narrative that European media, and increasingly American media, have covered extensively. Denmark has also taken military steps. European NATO members have deployed additional forces to Greenland, reinforcing the message that the alliance takes the territory's defense seriously, even if the threat comes from within NATO itself. This is unprecedented. NATO members positioning forces to deter potential aggression from the alliance's largest member. The symbolic weight of that action cannot be overstated. The military dimension raises uncomfortable questions about what Trump might actually do. He has repeatedly declined to rule out force. His administration has discussed all options. While a U.S. military operation against a NATO ally seems almost unimaginable, the fact that European governments are taking it seriously enough to reinforce their positions suggests the threat is not being dismissed entirely. Let's step back and assess what this confrontation reveals about the state of Western alliances. NATO was founded on the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all. The alliance exists to provide collective security, the guarantee that member nations will defend each other against external threats. What happens when one member threatens another? Trump's ultimatum doesn't involve military force yet, but it uses economic coercion to achieve territorial acquisition. The principle is the same, using power to take what belongs to an ally. If that becomes acceptable within NATO, the alliance's foundational logic collapses. Why would smaller members trust the system if the largest member can bully them without consequence? This isn't theoretical. Other NATO members are watching closely. Poland, the Baltic states, and Nordic countries have all relied on American commitment to collective defense. If the U.S. can threaten Denmark over Greenland, What stops it from pressuring others over different disputes? The precedent matters. European leaders understand this, which explains the intensity of their response. This isn't just about Greenland. It's about whether NATO remains a genuine alliance or becomes a hierarchy where American demands override sovereignty. The economic dimensions compound the political crisis. Economists estimate that Trump's 10% tariff could raise U.S. consumer prices by approximately 0.15%, with tripled impacts if the tariffs rise to 25% or if the 2025 trade agreement collapses entirely. That means American households would pay more for European goods, cars from Germany, wine from France, pharmaceuticals from Denmark and the UK. These numbers may seem small in percentage terms, but they translate into real dollars. American families already dealing with elevated prices would face another squeeze. The political calculus is worth considering. Does the administration believe voters will accept higher costs for a territorial acquisition that most Americans don't support? Europe faces its own exposure. Germany, as the largest EU exporter to the United States, is particularly vulnerable. The auto industry, companies like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz, depends heavily on American sales. A 25% tariff would make German cars significantly more expensive for American buyers, potentially costing sales and jobs. Swedish vehicle manufacturers face similar risks. French wine producers are already dealing with separate tariff threats that could reach 200%. The pharmaceutical sector adds another layer of complexity. Denmark and the UK both host major pharmaceutical companies that supply the American market. Tariffs on medications could raise healthcare costs for American patients, a politically toxic outcome. Whether the administration has considered this dimension is unclear, but the pain cuts both ways. American companies depend on European markets too. The EU represents one of the world's largest consumer economies. Restricting access to that market through the anti-coercion instrument or retaliatory tariffs would hurt American exporters, tech platforms, and financial services firms. American agricultural producers have reason to worry. The EU has previously retaliated against U.S. tariffs by targeting farm products from politically important states. Bourbon, soybeans, and orange juice have all been caught in past trade disputes. Farmers who supported the current administration might find their products priced out of European markets. This is the trap of trade wars. Both sides suffer, and the question becomes who can absorb the damage longer. History suggests these conflicts rarely produce clear winners. They produce costs, disruptions, and lasting damage to relationships that took decades to build. And there's another dimension here that extends beyond economics: global perception. For 80 years, the United States positioned itself as the guarantor of international order. America helped create the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, NATO, and the rules-based system that governs international relations. The core promise was that disputes would be settled through negotiation and law, not coercion and force. Trump's Greenland ultimatum contradicts that legacy directly. Using tariffs to pressure an ally into surrendering territory is the kind of behavior the U.S. traditionally condemned when other countries did it. The comparison to Putin's territorial claims in Ukraine, which European leaders have explicitly drawn, is politically devastating. It suggests moral equivalence between American and Russian conduct. Whether that comparison is fair or not, it has now entered the public discourse. And once an ally starts comparing you to an adversary, restoring trust becomes extraordinarily difficult. So where does this go from here? Several outcomes remain possible, and the trajectory depends on decisions that haven't been made yet. One scenario: Trump's threats are negotiation theater, and a face-saving deal emerges. Perhaps the US gets expanded military access or investment rights in Greenland without actual territorial transfer. Denmark declares sovereignty preserved, Trump claims victory, markets stabilize, and the crisis fades. This outcome requires both sides to find language that allows everyone to claim success. Given the public positions already staked out, finding that language will be difficult, but not impossible. The problem with this scenario is that Trump has repeatedly said there's no going back. When a leader makes public commitments of that nature, backing down carries political costs. The question becomes whether Trump values a deal more than he values appearing strong. His history suggests he values the appearance of winning above almost everything else. Another scenario. Tariffs take effect on February 1st, and both sides escalate. Europe activates countermeasures, trade volumes drop, markets remain volatile, and the dispute drags on for months. Neither side backs down because both have staked political credibility on their positions. The damage compounds. In this scenario, the conflict becomes self-reinforcing. Each escalation triggers a response, which triggers a counter-response. Businesses caught in the middle face mounting uncertainty. Investment decisions get delayed. Supply chains get disrupted. The economic costs grow, and so does the political difficulty of backing down after absorbing those costs. A third scenario. The crisis accelerates European moves towards strategic autonomy. Leaders like Macron have long advocated for Europe to reduce dependence on American security and economic ties. This confrontation could provide the political momentum for that shift. More European defense spending, less reliance on American guarantees, and a fundamentally different transatlantic relationship. European strategic autonomy has been discussed for years, but always faced the objection that it was unnecessary. America would always be there. Trump's behavior undermines that assumption. If Europe concludes that American reliability is fundamentally in question, the case for independent European capabilities becomes much stronger. This wouldn't happen overnight, but the political window for major investments in European defense and economic resilience has suddenly opened wider. A fourth scenario deserves consideration, even though it seems unlikely. Greenland itself changes the equation. The territory has its own government and an independence movement. If Trump's pressure inadvertently accelerates Greenlandic moves toward full independence from Denmark, the entire framework shifts. An independent Greenland would negotiate with the United States directly, and might extract far better terms than Trump is currently offering. The legal dimension adds another variable. A pending U.S. Supreme Court ruling on tariff authority could limit Trump's ability to implement these measures unilaterally. If the court constrains executive tariff power, the administration's leverage diminishes significantly, but legal processes are slow, and significant damage can occur before they reach resolution. The court case matters because it addresses a fundamental constitutional question. How much authority does the president have to impose tariffs without congressional approval? If the justices rule that certain tariffs require legislative action, Trump would need to secure votes in Congress, a far more complicated process. But even a ruling against executive tariff power might not resolve this crisis if it comes months from now. What we know with certainty is that this moment has altered how America's closest allies perceive American reliability. Trust, once broken, does not repair quickly. Even if the immediate crisis resolves, the underlying questions persist. Can allies count on the United States to honor its commitments? Will American power be used to defend the international order or to undermine it? Is NATO a genuine alliance or a tool of American dominance? These questions didn't exist in their current form a week ago. Now they define the conversation at the world's most important gatherings. The protesters in Nuuk carrying "Greenland is not for sale" signs captured something essential. Sovereignty is not a commodity. Territory cannot be purchased through threats, and alliances built on shared values cannot survive if one member treats the others as subordinates. There's a deeper issue here that goes beyond Greenland itself. The post-World War II international order was built on certain assumptions: that borders are inviolable, that disputes are resolved through negotiation rather than coercion, that strong nations don't bully weak ones, and that allies defend rather than threaten each other. These principles weren't always perfectly honored, but they provided a framework, a set of rules that most nations agreed to follow most of the time. Trump's Greenland ultimatum challenges that framework directly. If economic coercion can be used to acquire territory from an ally, what else can it be used for? If one NATO member can threaten another without consequence, what does NATO membership actually mean? If deals between allies can be discarded when inconvenient, why make deals at all? These are not abstract questions. They have practical consequences for every nation calculating its interests. Smaller countries that depend on American protection are reassessing their options. Larger powers that might have hesitated to challenge American dominance are taking notes. The credibility that America spent decades accumulating is being spent in days. What happens next depends on decisions that haven't been made yet. In Washington, in Brussels, in Copenhagen, and in capitals across Europe. But the choices made in the coming weeks will shape transatlantic relations for years, possibly decades, to come. February 1st approaches, the date when the first tariffs are scheduled to take effect. That deadline creates pressure on both sides. Either a deal emerges before then, or the conflict enters a new phase. European governments are planning their countermeasures. Markets are pricing in continued volatility. Businesses are making contingency plans. The world is watching. The markets have already rendered their verdict. The allies have stated their positions. The question now is whether anyone is prepared to step back from the edge, or whether this becomes the crisis that redefines the Western alliance entirely. What remains unresolved will determine whether this moment becomes a temporary rupture or a permanent fracture. The tariff deadline looms. The Supreme Court case proceeds. European solidarity faces its first major test under pressure, and Greenland, the small Arctic territory at the center of this geopolitical storm, waits to learn whether its future will be decided by its own people or by powers far away. We're watching this unfold in real time. The outcomes remain uncertain, but what's no longer uncertain is that something fundamental has changed, and there is no guarantee it can be changed back.